It's a great pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed this meeting immensely. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. The first half will be about economics, the second half about my own experience, and the third half about what I see as the issue for the future. So economists are easy to dislike. They're obnoxious, they're very self-confident, and they're often wrong. I want to talk about where they go wrong. I want to explain to you how you fight economists. One of the things is... As an economist. One of the things is economics is driven by assumptions. And the assumptions are commonplace, they're widely accepted, and they're often dead wrong. The second thing is economists want to avoid value judgments. The whole goal in the last century, certainly the last 80 years, has been for a science, and a science can't be subjective, and value judgments are subjective. However, you can only make policy conclusions, this is thanks to David Hume, by making value judgments. And economists do this because they make implicit value judgments, which are accepted by all economists. And so I've been involved in fighting in billion-dollar litigation with a Nobel Prize winner on the other side whom I know is not telling the truth. And the judge understands nothing except that guy's a Nobel Prize winner and Hanemann isn't. And the question is, how do you wage an argument? And the answer is you have to focus on identifying the implicit assumptions and the implicit value judgments. You have to make them explicit, you have to show what happens, and you have to show that those are not reasonable. And you then have to follow out what happens if you change them. That's the key thing. Now, economics gets some things right. And one thing is the importance of incentives in driving behavior. There's a lot of discussion of cognition, of psychology. I've studied this. I've worked with some of the top people in the world on this. That discussion, though, tends to omit incentives. One reason why people do X instead of Y. There's two reasons why evil occurs. One is people don't understand that this is terrible, and the other is people do understand that it's terrible, but it's good for them. And you need to understand the role of incentives. And incentives are not entirely monetary. Economists are wrong in thinking monetary incentives move behavior. And the other thing is trade-offs. I mean, at the bottom, we face a trade-off. Why should I spend money to achieve this goal? Is it worth it? Do I have to do it? Benefit cost analysis, broadly conceived, is exactly what we need to address. Getting the details right, doing it in a humane manner is important. And it's never a calculation to one decimal point. But nevertheless, the broad question we need to address is, why is it worth doing this? What do we accomplish? And a major problem with economic models, but also a lot of the non-economic analysis of adaptation and vulnerability and everything else, is it ignores distribution. The essential problem is Party A is spending money which brings benefits to Party B, whether it's to reduce emissions, whether it's to increase protection against extreme events. And at the bottom of the day, to change behavior, you need to explain to somebody why he should do it. And there are really only three things. You can explain to him, you can try to persuade him that it's in his interest, you can try to persuade him that it is morally the right thing to do, or you can bribe him. And I would note that when the British Parliament abolished slavery in the 1810 or whatever it was, they voted to pay compensation to slave owners. And the point I want to make is I think all three of these items are part of an agenda. I couldn't resist dealing with whoever asked this question, why do economists believe in growth? Well, they have models where there's a single individual. The whole economy or whatever is represented as a single individual who cares only essentially about aggregate income or wealth. And there are no externalities. If you had such an individual, why the hell would he not be better off if he had a higher income? The assumption follows exclusively, the conclusion follows from the assumptions being made. And I want to relate this. A number of economists, but Steve Schneider pointed this out. If you look at climate change, we're going to be growing anyway. We'll be growing less quickly if we devote resources to mitigation or adaptation. At the end of the day, it means we will reach a given level of wealth 3 years later, in 2103 instead of 2100. And that is the key framing. Now, I'm an environmental economist. The field goes back to 1920 to a conceptual piece, but it really took off in the late 1960s, and the key concept is an externality, where somebody takes an action which yields benefits or costs to other people, not just to him. Those are the social benefits. And this is the basic argument against the notion that the market produces outcomes in the public interest. The challenge is to measure those social costs, to measure the environmental damage, and that really happened in the around 1917. My own research was fortunate enough to be part of this, and it came together very quickly as a field known as non-market valuation. It was sponsored in part by the EPA. I had a PhD grant, and it's became widely used in the US government. These are two reports. This is the guidelines the EPA puts out for doing economic analysis of environmental regulation. The Clean Air Act requires a 20-year reassessment of the costs and benefits of the act. That's the last one. And so climate change is no different in some ways conceptually than the externalities economists in the US have been analyzing for 35 years, almost 40 years now. On its scale and its moral significance, it's larger, the details are much harder, but this is no different. Switching very quickly to my own career, I got interested in non-market evaluation, in valuing reduction in pollution at beaches in Boston. I got hired at Berkeley. I had a quiet life in the ivory tower. I got tenure. And then I got lucky enough to get invited to do two things. I got asked to become the economic staff of the State Water Rights Agency in California, just as a major water war was starting up about regulating diversions to Southern California, a water war which is still on to this day, still unresolved. I worked with two other staff people to write the report. When it came out, all hell broke loose. The head of the water agency for Southern California described this as a dagger aimed at the hearts of 20 million Southern Californians. A senator in Sacramento referred to us as intellectual midgets. Every day the Sacramento Bee was the front page of the Sacramento Bee. We were saved. This is something useful if you can do it. After 9 days, when it was discovered that a lady who ran a lodging house in Sacramento had been murdering her clients to take their welfare checks, and that was the only relief. We then got moved inside the paper. I also got, so this is divine intervention. I also got involved in non-market valuation, valuing an oil spill. I got involved putting together a team of economists who worked for Alaska. Alaska had several distinguished Nobel Prize winners on its side. I've been involved in some other major oil spills that you may have heard of. And in 1992, my colleague Tony Fisher and I were invited. We'd published on irreversibility in economics. We got invited to a conference. We wrote a little piece, and we made 3 points that I still believe today. First of all, Tony argued we shouldn't just focus on a doubling. It might be more than a doubling. What happens then? I argued that the story is really about adjustment costs and what happens to stocks of human capital, stocks of natural capital. And also, we said the economic models are equilibrium models. Most of the action is in disequilibrium. The costs of adjustment are out of equilibrium phenomena. They're invisible to these models. Well, 10 years later, this wonderful mentor, Guido Franco, running the California climate scenarios project, invited me to become involved, set up a center, and I collaborated with Guido through 3 rounds of projects. In 2004, January, Schwarzenegger took office, but the Union of Concerned Scientists became involved with this. As a result, of that collaboration, we published a PNAS paper. Catherine Hayhoe was the lead author, and a series of brochures. There was an AGI workshop here 10 years ago, and that was where I got to know John. But then Arnold made climate change his #1 priority. And on June the 1st, 2005, in San Francisco, he unveiled his initiative. He wanted 4 scientists behind them. I was one of the scientists. The other 3 are real scientists, Steve and 2 others. He said something, he gave a wonderful speech, and I think as an exercise in communication, it hasn't been matched. And I pulled out 3 statements, he said. First, the time for action is now. Secondly, this is threatening us in California. Thirdly, and I thought this was brilliant, in the past, we didn't know this was damaging. But now that we do know, it would be unconscionable to keep doing it. And I don't think any politician in the US has given as wonderful a talk. Very quickly, I want to focus on the 3 sets of issues that I see as important. They're related to one another. The first one is the crucial need to express impacts in a monetary equivalent, not as the only metric, but unless we can talk about the impacts of climate change as being equivalent to an X% reduction in the income of particular groups, of the whole country, or whatever, we will get nowhere. Because at the end, for some of us, it's a moral issue. It doesn't matter. But for other people, they want to know, why are we doing this? What do we stand to lose? And we need a function. I observed Ottmar Edenhofer in Bonn in June rejecting this. And that's because he believes we should push for 2 degrees, and any discussion of what would happen at 3 degrees, it undermines that. But the fact is, we're not going to make 2 degrees, and people at some point are going to say, why is it so terrible? Why can't we have 2.5 or 3 or whatever? Why does it matter? And we need the function. It's not going to be known perfectly or without error or whatever, but this question of not what is the damage at a particular point, but how does it change as you move from one level to another? And has to be answered in part in monetary terms. Now, there are many integrated assessment models which connect economic activity to changes in climate, changes in temperature, and so on. There are very few which translate that into impacts and equivalent changes on well-being. And essentially, the ones that exist do it badly. Now, there's an underlying tension, and this goes to the issues we discussed on the first day of scale. Impacts are local, and you need to be able to represent things at the level of water districts or whatever. Otherwise, this is meaningless. You have this massive tension of local spatial scale for some analyses, global scale for others, and also the variables you track, because temperature is not a sufficient statistic, for anything. That is a computing challenge, and I think it's not just a challenge for computing power, it's one of strategy. It seems to me we need a way of moving to different scales rather than one model which in the model does everything. So this is difficulty. The key fact is that if we just aggregate and look at the average change in temperature over some period of time or over some space, we understate the damage when the damage function is convex. And the more convex it is, the more increasing the damage is, the more we understate this. And what we're measuring now is this, and this is what matters to people. And that is the basic challenge we face. Now, there are a couple of other things. In the 3 major, very aggregate functions, each developed by one man, who worked very hard. These were developed in the 1990s based on the economic papers published after the second assessment. And although the models have been revised, as of last year, they didn't reflect any published paper published since 2001. Now, the economic literature of economists measuring impacts has mushroomed since then. The non-economic paper measuring impacts, there must be 10,000 papers that have appeared, or 5,000 papers. These are not reflected in the literature, and they make a difference because the more recent work is disaggregated and shows things quickly. This is the dice function. The original version related to the literature was 2000. There have been 3 iterations since then. The damages move up and down without any explanation for what has changed. This is Nordhaus's judgment on 4 points of time without any explanation. The underlying problem, I have just 3 slides, I'll go, is there's this disconnect. The impact scientists don't want to touch economics. Many of the economists don't read anything if it doesn't have a dollar sign. There is no communication between these two communities, and there's no forum that brings them together to sit down through a table and hash this out. Last point I want to make is the importance of extreme weather events. There's evidence, which I'll show you in a moment, that for the next few decades, maybe 50 years, the whole story is associated with extreme events. And if you don't measure them, you may as well not spend any time measuring damages. This is work I did with my former student, Wolfram Schlenker. We have a model of the impact on farmland, U.S. farmland, U.S. agricultural profitability. There are 3 variables: precipitation during the growing season, degree days in the, quote, normal range during the growing season, and degree days over 34. The other prominent papers in the literature by Michael Greenstone excludes that variable and finds essentially no effect on U.S. agriculture. What we find is, in the near term and with low emissions, it's essentially the whole story. The good news is that later on, when it gets warmer, normal warming starts becoming damaging. But the essential point is the ability to have a damage function and try and develop some understanding of turning points where extreme events kick in. This is the wrap-up. So we need a new approach to brainstorming a damage function. And we need to do the analysis with an extreme event and without an extreme event, and total up the damages and then combine them. We can't just do an analysis with the average. We need to really separate these two things out. We need, and this is why we need physical experts, we need to try and figure out where there are inflection points, where the damages become more significant. These will be specific to an area and to a type of impact. And so we need to bring together economists capable of doing valuation together with what I'm calling the impact scientists, and this is my last slide. Instead of discussing, whether one can monetize and whether one should monetize and what should be done, we should start trying to do it, recognizing that this will need to be improved later, the results will be highly imperfect, but God damn it, let's start doing it. Thank you.
And not only did you finish on time, but you left some time for a couple of follow-up questions. There are a couple of follow-up questions.
Yes.
You
start. I think you raised your hand.
Yes. You need to actually consider not just a extreme event, but the fact that there's likely to be a whole range of different extreme events and a trend.
Right. No, I agree. And how one does it, and you said damage function. Okay, a function of what? Well, the change in temperature isn't sufficient. No. So these are things to figure out. I had a professor who said one time, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And this is kind of, let's start off doing something. And this is why it's a real exercise which needs people to think how to do it. But we need a function, because at the end of the day, we need to be able to answer, why does it matter if it's 2.5 and not 2? Yeah.
So I think it is worth doing something badly sometimes, as long as you're doing the right thing badly. And your comment on the damage function, I think you can be a little more bold. The damage function is a function of the whole distribution of climate, the whole thing, not just a mean or all the extremes or temperature, everything. And yes, we can try to think about that and do it badly at the first go, right. But if we should start with the real problem.
No, I agree. And so literally, but if you want to compare this distribution with that distribution, let's say where this distribution is what you think of as 2 degrees warming, and that distribution is what you think of as 2.5 degrees. You need a sort of a parameter lambda or something. I mean, you need something. Anyhow, what is the argument of the function? I agree, is a serious question and needs thought. But all I'm saying is, right now we have damage functions which have no basis, are made up, absolutely made up, with no credible foundation at all, which I believe are too low and too flat. And so something has to be done to change them.
So,
Yeah.
let's take two more, John and Marty,
Yeah.
and then,
Yes,
then we'll
of
get
course,
everybody
yes.
up here.
Yes.
My question is, what do you think the connection or linkage of the efforts to do the social cost of
They use these ridiculous damage functions. Now they do sensitivity analysis. They say, suppose the coefficient was 3, not 2, and that's okay. And they come up with, but the whole point is the damage functions are rotten, and they have no foundation. They're based on papers that are way out of date, and so just tweaking these things. That's one thing. There is a growing literature which shows if you make systematic changes, the social cost of carbon becomes higher. In other words, this is not, without significant implications.
in a way that might effectively move policy?
I think it is. And very briefly, I respect Nordhaus. He's a brilliant economist. He's made major contributions. But his message for 25 years has been the impacts of climate change for the US are not very large. If they're bad for a small island in the Pacific, but those guys don't vote for the president in the US. I've published a back of the envelope, very crude estimate that his estimates of the damage in the US are maybe 3 to 4 times too low. But his message that basically the US doesn't have much at stake is wrong. And none of these models incorporates assessment 4 or the national assessment or any of those impacts. And they don't incorporate them because there's no $ in the national assessment or whatever. So it's as though those studies aren't out there.
I have an immediate follow-up to that. Is that okay?
Yeah, me too.
Everybody has an immediate.